In this video we're going to show you how to do Dresden 3 for the doilies and Dresden's design. And to get started, we of course have our battleizer hooped, and with ours we're going to use the optional bull batting. And for this particular one we're going to need a fabric 1, fabric 3, fabric 4, our background fabric, and our backing fabric. And then of course I have all the appropriate threads that you'll see on your instructions. I have this would be my quilting thread, and then I have a bobbin wound for that, and I have my thread A in a bobbin wound, and my thread B with a bobbin wound, and then thread C is going to be my black. So let's get started so we can make our third Dresden. Okay, for step number 1, I have the battleizer hooped, and I just have that gray neutral thread in the needle, embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and I'm going to start the machine so we can sew a placement stitch. Okay, step number 2 is the optional step. That's the step where we choose to add the wool batting or not add the wool batting. In our case, we're going to do it just so you can see how it's done. I have my water-soluble thread in the needle, and we've done our placement stitch, and now I'm going to lay the wool batting over the top of the placement stitch. And the machine will stitch a zigzag stitch to hold that to the battleizer. Alright, for step 3, we're still going to continue with the water-soluble thread, and we're going to take our background fabric and we're just going to center it over the wool batting. And if you didn't do the wool batting, then you would have skipped right to this step, and you can just place it right over the battleizer. And with the water-soluble thread, we're just going to sew a basting stitch. Alright, we have our background fabric on, and for step 4 I have put my thread A in the needle only, and we're going to sew the cross stitch. Here is the cross stitch from step 4. It's the Irish chain background. And now what we're going to do is I have water-soluble thread in the needle, and it's going to sew a placement stitch for step 5. For step 6, I'm going to take my fabric 4, and I am going to lay it right over the top of that placement stitch. I'm going to extend the fabric about 1/4 of an inch beyond where that stitch is, and make sure that I'm probably about 1/4 of an inch down in this area as well. And then we'll let the machine sew the tack down stitch. You can see it's doing a double stitch there, and that is where we're going to trim it close to the stitching. Let me bring it out a little bit for you. This is going to be rather sharp, this black and white. It's going to look pretty cool. So here I'm going to cut this right up to the stitching using my hoop scissors mini. And here I'm going to leave this 1/4 of an inch, and I'm a little less than 1/4 of an inch here. I can go ahead and leave that. Down here I could leave that, but it doesn't really matter. You can trim that, but leave at least 1/2 an inch there in that area. So now for step number 7, I got to refer to my instructions. We're going to place our background fabric. First of all, we're going to change from water-soluble thread to a neutral thread. Alright, now I can take my background fabric. I'm going to lay it right sides together and lay the raw edges even. And we're going to let the machine stitch the seam using neutral thread, not water-soluble, very important. Okay, then for step 8, you're going to flip the fabric right side up, finger press, smooth it out, and we can still leave that neutral thread in there, and we're going to sew a tack down stitch. bring it forward so you can see it better and I can cut it. So down here, what the fabric that we have there is fine to leave that there. I'm going to cut approximately 1/4 of an inch away from the stitching on this side, and over here on the curved edge, just like over here, we're going to cut right up to the stitching. And the difference is where we're cutting close to the stitching is finished as a machine applique, where here where you're leaving 1/4 of an inch, it's actually the seam for the next piece. So for step 9, I'm going to take my fabric 1, and I'm just going to refer to my chart. So remember what my fabric 1 was, this fabric. And I'm going to lay that, leaving the same neutral thread in there. I have 2 pieces here. Right side down, and those raw edges even. And the machine sews the seam. And then step 10, you're going to flip that fabric so the right side is up. And you're going to finger press. And still with the neutral thread, we're going to sew a tack down stitch. For step 11, I'm going to place a piece of background fabric right side down with the raw edges even. And again, with the neutral thread, we're going to sew another seam. For step 12, we're going to flip that background fabric right side up, and I'm going to give it a good finger press and sew the tack down stitch. Alright, and I'm going to trim 1/4 of an inch here because that's going to be a seam for the next piece of fabric. And up to the curved stitching, I'm going to use the Hoop Scissors Mini to trim right up close to the stitching, and then I'll be right back. Alright, I have that background fabric trimmed up. I'm going to take my fabric 4 for step 13, and I'm going to lay it right side down, raw edges even, and the machine will sew a seam. Okay, I have my seam sewed, and I have switched to water-soluble thread, and for step 14, you're going to flip fabric 4 right side up, do your little finger press, and sew that tack down stitch using the water-soluble thread. And now let me trim this, and then we'll go on to the next step. For step 15, we're going to place our fabric 3 in this corner, and we're just going to peek to make sure we have everything covered up all the way, and we're going to use the water-soluble thread and sew a tack down stitch. Alright, I'm just trimming this fabric right up close to the stitching. I think this is going to be a very striking block. For step 16, I put my thread C in the needle only. I still have my embroidery bobbin thread in the bobbin, and we're going to sew some stitching in these areas. For step 17, I have thread B in the needle only, and we're going to sew some embroidery right here. For step 18, we're going to add our backing fabric onto the back of our hoop. So I will flip it over, and if you want, you can spray a little KK2000 or 505 spray in the back of your backing fabric. And then you're just going to want to center that over the back. And just do a quick check underneath, make sure it's centered real nice. And I have water-soluble thread in the needle only. And I'm going to flip it back and put it on the machine. I always like to peek under there. Sorry if you got the view of the top of my head. But I always like to peek under just to make sure that it didn't flop over. And we like to call that a Dunlop if it happens to get stitched in like that. So with water-soluble thread in the needle, let's sew the basting stitch that'll hold the backing fabric on. For step 19, we're going to be doing some quilting steps, and so since our backing fabric is on, anytime after the backing fabric is on, I have fumble fingers this morning. Once your backing fabric is on, you're going to want to make sure that your needle thread and your bobbin thread match. So we're going to use thread A, which is our dark gray color. And what we're going to also do is, once your backing fabric is on, it's also very important that you make sure that your automatic thread cutter, if your machine happens to have that feature, that it is turned off. The other thing you're going to do is, before you begin sewing anything from here on out, you're going to do a needle down, needle up, so you can bring that bobbin thread to the top, and that helps for a nice, cleaner, neater looking back to your quilt block. For step 20, and I'll try not drop the bobbin this time, is we're going to put our thread B in the needle and also in the bobbin so that it matches. And we're going to do some more quilting steps. And again, just a reminder, I just want to reiterate that you need to do a needle down, needle up, bring that bobbin thread to the top, and then begin sewing. Step 21 is your final step, and again, I'm matching my bobbin thread with my needle thread, which is we call it the quilting thread for this step. We'll just give you a little peek. There's the front so far, and the back. It's looking good, so now we will stitch the quilting. This is our Dresden 3, and I'm going to trim this and show you how to trim it using the Trimmer by George 2.0. As though, well, obviously you're making it for the quilt, but as though you're adding a block to every side of it, which we know you would be to these 3 sides to make the full circle for the Dresden. But if you're going to be adding a border, you basically trim these 2 sides then the same way that you would trim the inside. So just for a little review, you can hit pause or stop if you already know what you're doing, but for those who don't, I just went and did it. It's just natural to just do it. But anyway, we're going to take this fabric on the front and pull it back, and the metal edge of the Trimmer by George, we're going to snug right up there between the fabric on the front and the battleizer, and a little tug. I have a 60mm rotary cutter, and we are going to use that to trim the battleizer and also the backing fabric away. And we're going to do that on all 4 sides. Snug it in there between those 2 layers, and 60mm rotary cutter to trim it away. And we just keep rotating all the way around. And this is the last side. And then with the Trimmer by George, what you can do is you can flip it upside down so that you can use the ruler part. And we're going to use this basting stitch, and we're going to use the 1/4 inch mark, and we're going to cut it 1/4 inch from that basting stitch, and that way your blocks will be ready to be joined together. And we're going to do that on all 4 sides. And then once you get that done, then you'll be ready to stitch them together. And we'll also show you a video on how to join them together and also how to do the sashing.